Hello everybody, welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Now on today's episode we are talking about Marchesa 2022, the premier Monarch Media event. Not only do we have a fantastic Monarch tournament this time around, but this time around it was in person. This is the first Monarch Media event that is IRL, in real life, in person. I was there, I attended, I made the top 16, but not the top 4 of this event. But you're not here to hear about me. You're here to hear about the top 4 of this cEDH tournament, and I'm so excited to bring this to you today. This is probably one of the most unique top 4s we've ever had on the channel. This has one of the most impressive runs we've ever seen in a cEDH tournament. There's literally so many things to be excited about from this tournament and from these results, and I don't want to sell it short. This is an insane top 4, an insane tournament. Thank you so much to Monarch Media for putting on this fantastic event. I had so much fun. I got to see so many people I know and care about in this community, and it was an amazing, amazing time. Let's jump into these decks, but before we do, just remember, while you're here on YouTube, hit that like button and that subscribe button. And if you're feeling extra generous, check out patreon.com/comedianmtgs. If you like top 4 videos like this, it helps a ton if you go help support the channel. All right, let's get into it. All right, our first deck in the top 4 of this tournament is Legend Kill with a Tymna Thrasios Turbo Hermit Druid list. Now, this list is pretty interesting. It is running, as I mentioned, Hermit Druid as the main win con. So the idea is that you use Hermit Druid, you play 0 basic lands, so that when you activate Hermit Druid, it reveals the entire deck, puts it all in the graveyard. You then have an Archimedes trigger, you can bring back your Fate Stitcher, and you use the spell Dread Return. By sacrificing 3 creatures, you can bring back your Thassa's Oracle and win the game that way. Now, there's Laboratory Maniac as a backup plan, and obviously ways to be able to draw if you have your entire library in your graveyard. This list I refer to as kind of a Turbo Druid list because it is running, as I mentioned, Narcomoeba and Fate Stitcher, which are only usually run in the most proactive of Hermit Druid lists, and it's also running the Breakfast pile. So for those familiar with Breakfast Hulk or the Time of Flash Hulk, you'll recognize the pile of Nomads and Core and Cephalid Illusionist. Now, the way this pile works is that Cephalid Illusionist will mill 3 cards when it is targeted by an ability, and the way Nomads and Core, it allows you to pay 0 to redirect the next 1 damage that it would receive to Cephalid Illusionist. And the way that this works is you're able to instant speed mill the entire library, and that obviously has a lot of benefits, which is why it was the main Hulk pile for a really long time during the Flash Winter era. This list is pretty proactive for a Tymna and Thrasios deck, but it does have, grindier options here. We have Collector Oof, which is obviously a really solid card in the format right now. I was originally going to take a Tymna Thrasios Hulk list to this tournament, similar to Jamaican dudes from the last tournament, and I played a couple games in which resolving an early Collector Oof was just absolutely crippling for the entire table. Like, there's a lot of pods in this format that cannot get out of that card. Malevolent Hermit has been a huge card for the self-mill strategies. Now, it's really important to know that Malevolent Hermit allows the Dread Return to be uncounterable when you play it for its disturb size, as we will see. When it comes out of the graveyard on its Benevolent Geist side, it makes your non-creature spells uncounterable. So when you mill your entire library, Benevolent Geist is in the graveyard, you pay 3 mana to disturb it, and then suddenly your Dread Return cannot be countered, which is obviously huge for this interaction. And a big downside to Hermit Druid has been, for a long time, you have this super compact creature combo in a 1 card in Hermit Druid, or 2 cards in the Breakfast combo, but you still have to cast a sorcery at the end of your very compact creature combo. Now with Benevolent Geist, you can use all creatures to get you to the win because Dread Return will be uncounterable due to Benevolent Geist's ability. So that's obviously really strong, and Benevolent Geist / Malevolent Hermit has been a huge addition for these decks. I really also like that this deck is running Savine's Reclamation as a backup Dread Return. There's also a couple other pieces, like having Postmortem Lynch, which not only can get you back a hasty Hermit Druid, it can also get you a Thassa's Oracle out of your graveyard. So there's a lot of redundancy in the way that this deck works, which is once again why I referred to it as a Turbo Druid deck, because it really is hyper-focused on that Druid plan. You'll often see decks that run Hermit Druid tend to be more like Tymna Thrasios grind decks, decks that happen to play Hermit Druid as their main win con because it's so compact. However, here we're obviously focusing on Hermit Druid as the primary win con for this deck. Then obviously we also have Tainted Pack and Demonic Consultation. Playing Thassa's Oracle in your list, being in black, it makes sense that these combos would just be in the list because obviously you can just steal games by Thassa's Consult in many situations. With the low CMC of this deck, it's not too surprising to me that the Ad Nauseam is being run here. Obviously, it's not one of the more proactive Ad Nauseam decks in our format at the current moment, and definitely there can be some awkwardness with the way Hermit Druid and the Breakfast Pals work with Ad Nauseam. But the curve in this deck, as we just saw, is 1.12, which is super tight. So it kind of makes sense that Ad Naus will be run here. As we're going through, I'm noticing no Stony Silence, no Null Rod. So Collector Oof is really the only way to be able to shut off artifacts. But it also kind of makes sense because, once again, being a Stax deck isn't the primary game plan of what's happening here. This deck is primarily a Turbo Druid deck that happens to have the ability to really not need artifacts and play a card like Collector Oof. All in all, super solid list here. Obviously, any sort of Tymna Thrasios pile is going to be pretty well placed. It has a lot of just good generic value cards here, a lot of free interaction, stuff like that. And it's very cool to see a Turbo Druid deck make it to the top 4. As I mentioned, we're usually seeing like a bit of a grindier Druid list as the lists that tend to be dominant lately, but a very aggressive Druid list is one that I know I'm obviously prone to playing because I love me a very quick Hermit Druid. So it's really cool to see this deck, and congratulations to Legend for making the top 4. List number 2. Now, when I tell you the Turbo Druid deck may be the least spicy deck in this top 4, that's not a dig at that last list, because that list was super cool and super spicy. It's just telling you how much of a roller coaster we're about to continue going down in this list. So right now we have Phyrexian Tutor, and they have a Sans White Razakats list. This is Razakats in the Thrasios Vile Smasher combination. Now, this is super cool for me personally because I had explored this space a little while ago, but never really could get the combination to work. So I'm just super excited to see a Sans White Razakats list make it to the top 4 of this tournament after it being kind of not talked about as the way to go with Razakats. Like, the Tymna Thrasios variant has been just widely accepted as the only way to play Razakats for a really long time. And there have been people who've been working on the different versions of it. There's been people working on this. There's been people working on Kenrith list, but it is super cool to see a red version of Razakats. One of the things that I think is one of the most interesting cards to pair with Razakats is Dockside Extortionist. I feel like it really cleans up a lot of the Razakats lines, and I feel like that's a huge benefit for being able to play this version of the Razakats strategy. Now, when I say Razakats, if you're not sure what I mean, Razakats the Foul-Blooded is an 8/8 demon that the whole point is to reanimate this creature onto the battlefield. And you pay 2 life, sack another creature, and you get to tutor any card and put it into your hand. And basically the point is that by the time you get Razakats on the battlefield, you want to be able to tutor enough cards that you just win the game. And obviously having a source of repeatable tutoring in your deck is absolutely huge. A lot of the time decks like this tend to win with Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation, but clearly there's other lines available here. I love Consecrated Sphinx as the backup reanimation target. That's super spicy. And being in this color combination, you just get to play like a lot of really solid creatures. You get to play Notion Thief, Spellseeker, Opposition Agent. You get to have a Seedborn Muse backup plan because you're on Thrasios as one of your commanders, which is, for those who know me, a weakness of mine. I love some Seedborn Muse. Going into the list, we start to see some of the traditional Razakats lines, things with Life Death, Eldritch Evolution, Neoform, all these reanimation effects. Culling Ritual, obviously an amazing card in the current format. Wheel of Fortune, interesting here as one of the 2 wheels in the deck chosen. I like that they're both wheels that do not shuffle your graveyard back in, so I like that there's no Time Twister in this list. I think that's a super solid way of approaching this. And the more I look at this list, the more I really enjoy it. You get to play like your Sylvan Libraries, your Animate Deads to bring back your reanimated creatures. There's not a ton of reanimation effects now that I'm like taking a deeper look. There's straight up reanimate, there's Life Death, and it looks like just those two and Animate Dead, which is like a really tight reanimation package. I know other lists were like working on that. And because you're not in white, you don't get loyal retainers as sort of your like survival of the fittest chain ender, but you can always get a spell seeker with your creature tutors and get reanimate to reanimate your creatures. But yeah, this list is just super cool. I mean, it's a lot of the stuff you would expect out of Razakats. The fact that there's an Adnos in a deck that's playing Razaketh, Consecrated Sphinx, and Seedborn Muse is so, I don't know how else to say it, but ballsy. Like, that is so cool. There is just like, that is a bold move to say the least. The CMC, wow, even with all of those hits, the rest of the deck is so tight that the CMC is 1.27. Honestly, it makes a lot of sense for Ad Nauseam to be playing, and because you have red in your color pie, it's not nearly as awkward as, say, traditional Razakats is with Ad Nauseam. Although, if I'm not mistaken, I know a bunch of the new Razakats list are moving over to playing Ad Naus. So, I think just playing red in the format right now, having Underworld Breach in your deck, having Dockside in your deck, means that your Ad Nauseams are just like margins better than decks that do not have red in them. Obviously, paying off really well here. I really like the innovation of dipping this archetype into red. I love that, you know, the Notion Thief package. I love having opposition here for survival of the fittest. I think this is just like a really solid, cool deck, and I love that this archetype was able to jump into red for the color pie. I think it's super cool. Once again, the ability to combine Razaketh and Dockside Extortionist, I think, is a great interaction that's been kind of slept on historically. And this deck is, I mean, apart from that, it's just running a bunch of really, really good cards. Like having Thrasios and the ability to have Deflecting Swat and Fierce Guardianship up as early as turn 1 with your commander is not something you can really afford to overlook. And I think it's just a super cool list, and it gets to play all of the grindy Thrasios stuff on top of these really powerfule black and red cards. So if we notice, it's kind of similar to what Gustav was working on in the last tournament, the winning list, in the fact that taking a Thrasios Vial Smasher, a traditionally sans red shell. So for example, Gustav was taking Hermit Druid and brought it into Thrasios Vial Smasher space, and now we see Phyrexian Tutor here bringing the traditionally Tymna Thrasios Razakats into the Thrasios Vial Smasher space. So it's cool. It's a very cool ability to sort of shift your archetype around to be able to play into the strengths and weaknesses of the specific colors you're working on. Very spicy list. Very excited to see it done here. And as I mentioned, personally, I was working on a similar deck for a long time, so I'm glad to see someone actually actualize the concept that I was trying to look at. It's very, very cool. But here is where the spice goes even higher. We have the mono white guy, Ivaldi, also known as Charles, personal friend and avid brewer in this format, playing Heliod, God of the Sun. Now, if you'll notice, I did not say Heliod Sun Crowned. I said Heliod, God of the Sun. That is right. This top 4 list was the list that knocked me out of the semifinals. I think they only had like 1 loss on day 1. This deck was performing extremely well, and I made this note to Charles after we had played and we were just talking after the tournament, and I said to him, I told him that his play during this tournament, and you can see it during the semifinals match, was some of the tightest play I have seen out of him in a while. And maybe the most tight play I've ever seen out of Charles. It was very, very impressive. This is not the first top 4 from this deck. Charles has top 4'd a completely different tournament playing this list. And it's a hard list to be able to surround yourself with, and a hard list to be able to quantify. It has some interesting inclusions and it has some wild exclusions, but each of them is valid and really, really well thought out, and none of them are done in an impulsive way. And I think people have the ability to be very dismissive when looking at a deck like this due to the fact that it is a mono white Stax deck that is basically playing win conless Stax. However, the fact that this deck almost didn't time out of a single match during the Swiss, I think Charles only had a single draw in this whole competition, and sorry if I'm wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure only had a single draw and was able to actually win 3 or 4 games during this tournament with this deck in a 75-minute round is huge. And that says a lot about the power of what we're working with here. So let's get into the deck. So obviously, Heliod grants your other creatures vigilance, which is very relevant. There is many times in which I was not able to pressure Charles's life total during our semifinals match because of the fact that his hate bears had vigilance and he had a Sarah Ascendant out, and I was like, I'm never getting through that. And then an activated ability to put a 2/1 white cleric enchantment creature onto the battlefield, which once again is part of the end game engine. It helps to basically ensure that as the game progresses onward and onward, you're just eventually dead to 2/1s. Playing a lot of really wild cards, traditional stuff like Esper Sentinel, Sarah Ascendant, a lot of good stuff for just beating down your opponents. Weathered Wayfarer, I have never seen be more impressive than in Charles's hands. This card is very, very powerful if you have a deck that knows how to use it, and if you as a pilot know what to get with it. The card is actually really strong in that sense. And then just a ton of crippling hate bears that absolutely destroy the format right now. Things like Containment Priest stops all Neoform-esque tutors, stops anything coming out of the graveyard, hoses Winota, absolutely insane. Drannith Magistrate, which got out turn 2 on the play in our game and absolutely not only hosed me, but hosed the other 2 players in the game because we just couldn't find the removal we needed to get rid of it, and it hosed the entire game. Aethersworn Canvas, obviously Rule of Laws are huge right now. Mind Sensor, stopping your opponent's tutoring. Leonin Arbiter, also stopping your opponent's tutoring. And Charles and I had mentioned in discussions after the tournament that this is a card that because of the way it's worded, you have to pay for it when you have priority. And because of that, many opponents actually punted into Leonin Arbiter. So that's definitely worth noting if you're looking at that card. Spirit of Labyrinth, obviously insane against any draw engines in the format. Hushbringer, stopping ETBs and leave the battlefield. Stopping Protean Hulk decks. Huge in that sense. Honor Guard, stopping ETBs as well. Angel of Jubilation. So everything that you look at Yasharn and say, oh, that's a really good card because it stops X, Y, or Z, Angel of Jubilation does the same thing. It's just normally really hard to cast when you're not playing mono white. Sanctum Prelate is one of the best cards in Winota, and it's insane here. Eidolon of Rhetoric, as I mentioned, Hate Bears, insane. Linvala, against any creature deck, absolutely shuts them all down. Elish Norn, obviously, any stalled board state, really, really strong. So if you notice, all of the creatures that I'm mentioning here all have extremely high impact in the game. Now let's go over some of the spicier stuff. We have Peacekeeper, which if your game is resulting in combat, being able to say, I'm going to keep paying for Peacekeeper until I don't want to pay for Peacekeeper anymore, and then I'll let it die, is actually pretty huge. And then Catilda, Dawnheart Martyr, I saw at the very end of our semifinal match, but basically it's equal to the number of permanents you control that are spirits and enchantments. So it just becomes an insane beater because there's the cleric tokens, which are all enchantments, and any spirits in the deck, which is like Eidolon and Spirit of the Labyrinth, stuff like that. So with those creatures, Catilda just becomes like a wild clock for the match, and it has a backside as well, which is an enchantment that does the exact same thing. So it's redundancy on top of that. Now we see some board wipes out of this list, which as someone who was playing Winota against this deck, it was definitely very scary to know that anytime a Wrath of God or a Winds of Abandon might come down, or an Elish Norn, that was insane. Replenish is here because there are, as we can see down here, 27 enchantments in the deck, and we'll get into the details on some of those in a little bit. That's about it for the important parts of the source. There's 2 instants, that's it. And then we have some just like crippling artifacts here. Chalice of the Void, obviously really good against the faster archetypes in the format. Grafdigger's Cage, one of the most underplayed cards in the format right now, and just absolutely an insane Stax piece. If you can break parity on Grafdigger's Cage in your deck, you need to play Grafdigger's Cage in your deck. It's tough because it hurts a lot of proactive game plans, but Grafdigger's Cage is super strong. And in a deck like this, where you are playing everything and anything that shuts your opponents down, it's super huge. Null Rod, as we're going to see, there's also Stony Silence in this list. Torpor Orb, we mentioned ETBs being shut down. Static Orb is pretty interesting because if you'll remember, Heliod grants your creatures vigilance. Now, Static Orb and Storage Matrix here are really interesting because they allow this deck to take over combat. Because when combat is being controlled, your opponents have to choose whether to swing or to leave your creatures back for attack. But with Heliod, it grants all of your creatures vigilance, and therefore, cards like Static Orb and Storage Matrix don't affect your ability to control combat. Now, it obviously affects the amount of mana you're making per turn, but this deck is meant to play under these effects, and therefore has moments against that. And then obviously Trinisphere is just a good hate piece. So if you're noticing here, very importantly in the artifacts, there is no fast mana at all. None of these 1-drops are mana crypts. They're not soul rings. They're not mox diamonds. They're not chrome moxes. None of it. There is 0 of those effects in this deck. And it may seem wild to people that this is done, but this is a very intentional choice. This is not a player trying to do something spicy and throw it out there. This is not someone being like, I don't need a Soul Ring to win. This is a player who knows what they're doing with their deck and is making an intentional choice. Running both Stony Silence and Null Rod obviously shuts these effects down. On top of that, there are several other pieces that are affecting these things, like Storage Matrix and Static Orb. They affect the way that mana is being tapped in this game. Also, if you look at a lot of this deck, as I've talked about with Soul Ring specifically with Charles, there are a lot of colored pip in the mana cost of these cards. With Mana Crypt specifically, I totally get why you wouldn't want to play that in this deck, due to the fact that it's a grindier deck and it wants to be slowing the game down. And if you're putting a pressure on your own life total that your opponents can then utilize to get out from under your stacks, that's obviously very, very bad. Chrome Mox and Mox Diamond make sense a lot because they are card disadvantage on a 2-part scale. Not only are you playing a card that is ramping you out faster, but you're also going down a card to be able to use them, i.e. exiling with Chrome Mox or discarding a land to Mox Diamond. And as Charles mentioned, in mono white, you do not have card advantage. You just do not have as much card advantage as your opponents, and therefore Charles intentionally chose not to play those options because of the fact that you cannot afford to go card for card with your opponents. You need to be a little bit slower in order to be able to stop what your opponents are doing. But when your 1-drops and your 2-drops can cripple your opponents, like Containment Priest, Drannith Magistrate, Aethersworn Canonist, Leonin Arbiter, all of these are super strong offense already starting at 2. When you can do that with your opponents there, it makes sense that you want to be able to maybe be a little bit slower. However, that allows you to be able to play more impactful pieces and not go down cards in doing so. Now, Soul Ring, Charles has a fantastic Twitter post where he covers this whole thing. I don't know if I agree personally on Soul Ring. I think there's a lot of cards that Soul Ring can pay for in this list, especially like the dual costs of certain cards. However, I am not the main pilot of this deck, and I'm not here to argue it. Charles has a lot of succinct reasoning on it. You can find it all on Twitter. I'll see if I can find the link by the time I post this video. But the point being, even though I don't quite agree with that one exclusion, there is solid intentional reasoning behind it, and it clearly paid off because Charles had an insane performance with this deck, winning many matches to get to the top 4. And although we'll talk about the finals and the undefeated deck for this tournament, Charles had one of his Stax pieces removed incorrectly that was locking down the winning deck. Had that not happened, there is a solid chance that Charles actually ended up taking this game. So not only having an impressive run for the entirety of this tournament, but also having a solid chance of actually taking the entire thing down, it is hard to argue with the choice selection of what Charles has done for this list. And now we'll move on to the enchantments, which is, as you can see, just a lot of insane stuff. Deafening Silence, super powerful. On Thin Ice, a just removal spell for 1 mana. A lot of insane stuff. Planar Collapse, which is a board wipe as an enchantment. And Rest in Peace, a parity breaker at Luminarch Ascension, which is straight up just a win con. I was put in a terrible position because Luminarch Ascension hit the battlefield and I had to sacrifice a bunch of creatures to not lose to Charles. We're also seeing more board wipes here with Out of Time. So Out of Time, Planar Collapse, Wrath of God, Winds of Abandon, and Elishnorn, all ways to completely wipe your opponent's board. Follow the 3 in there, destroying lands, and just like a bunch of insane stuff, all of it providing a solid amount of value. Suppression Field being one of the best cards shown from this list. If you can play Suppression Field, that's another card that people sleep on a lot, and it's really good. It shuts down any activated abilities that aren't mana abilities by making them cost 2 more. And there's a lot of cards that get affected by this that you would not think of. Like a lot of them. Fetch lands being one of them. That's a huge target of this. So Suppression Field is very strong. And then another insane part of this deck is like some of the spicy stuff it gets to play in the lands department. Specifically, Serra's Sanctum, obviously with 27 enchantments, not including your commander, is super strong. One of the first times I ever played against Charles, they tutored for Serra's Sanctum super early on, and it was just like absolutely breaking this game in half. Same with Nykthos, Shrine of Nyx. Like, as you can imagine, with the amount of white permanents in this deck, it just makes ridiculous amounts of mana. And then some of the other lands have just like some really interesting, unique utility to them. Hall of Heliod's Generosity being a really good one on top of that. So this list is like a 10 on the spice scale. Absolutely. Playing some wild cards, omitting some wild cards. Congrats to Charles on piloting a deck that many people would be way too afraid to play to a top 4. And I'm not saying that in a way to be like, the heck with all the conventional wisdom, don't play your soul rings. Obviously, that's not where I'm coming from on this. What I'm saying in this is this was a well-researched pilot who did the hard work. A lot of the choices in here off the get-go will seem strange. And there is no primer for this list, which definitely makes it a little more difficult. But if you follow Charles on Twitter, he's done a lot of talking about this list. He's done a lot of just musing on mono white in general in the format, and a lot of musings on just like things and potential in this format. This deck is super solid. I was honored to lose to Charles in that top 16 match. I did not feel bad about that match whatsoever. I had a chance to get out of it by drawing a removal spell. I didn't draw it, and I ended up losing the match. It was still an insanely fun game. There was a ton of resources, a ton of back and forth, a lot of combat, a lot of insane stuff happening in the game. And Charles really earned his top 4 placement in this tournament. I think looking at this deck, people can really challenge a lot of what we looked at traditionally as decisions for our format, and just know that cEDH is an open space and brewing is still happening. People are still having conventional wisdom challenged all the time, and that's one of the things I love about it the most, is that decks like this one and the winner of the entire tournament that I will talk about in one moment can perform as well as they do is fantastic. It's a brewer's paradise, and I love cEDH for this reason. So without further ado, let's jump to not only the winner of the entire tournament, but an undefeated deck for this tournament. I played against this list as well. It was my last round of the Swiss. We have Koibito here with Magda Brazen Outlaw that went 7-0. Meaning 7 wins, not losing a single game, 5-0 on day 1, and winning the semis and winning the finals, not losing a single game. Insane. I literally have never heard of a cEDH performance like this. I've never heard of an undefeated player over 7 rounds. It is insane, an insane performance. Congrats to Koibito. A pleasure to play against. A very well thought player. I really enjoyed our match. As I mentioned, we played in the last round of Swiss. I was able to interact really well with the combo, because a lot of people have claimed that, some of the success of this deck was not knowing when to interact with it. And I as a pilot who knew exactly when to interact with it, stopped the combo going off and lost to the exact same combo going off the next turn. Let's explain what Magda does, because these lines are a little complicated, and I think a lot of the reason that people struggled against it. One thing to note with what I'm about to explain to you, these lines can win at instant speed. Many of the games won with this list were won because of the ability to interact and react by winning the game at instant speed. It was one of the crazy parts about fighting against Flash, and it's one of the crazy parts against fighting against this deck, is that you have the ability to win instant speed. To clarify, I am not comparing this deck to Flash. It did really well. It is not compared to Flash. Okay, just want to be super clear about that. Please understand this. So Magda Brazen Outlaw makes treasures when dwarves become tapped, and if you sacrifice 5 treasures, you can look for an artifact or dragon, put it on the battlefield in the shuffle. Obviously, the dragons aren't as important. The artifacts are the important part of this list. So there is a ton of dwarves being the cool cards in the early part of the game here. Bunch of early dwarves. And I did talk to Koibito during this tournament, obviously when we played, and they mentioned that there definitely were changes that they would make given the list and where it is right now, and that they wanted to make updates to the deck. But that being said, bunch of weird creatures, most of them just being the fact that they are either dwarves or specifically artifact shapeshifters or artifact dwarves. Now that is important, and I will explain how that comes up a little bit later, but the fact that there are multiple creatures here, as you can see, that are both artifacts and dwarves by type is very important for the combo in this list. So the combo involves, let's go down here, Clock of Omens. So what Clock of Omens says is that you can tap 2 untapped artifacts you control to untap an artifact. So what you do here is you use the Clock of Omens, you tap one of the artifact dwarves and another artifact. So there are many ways to make, as I mentioned, there are a couple artifact dwarves in the list. There are also cards like Ashnod's Transmigrant, Liquid Metal Torque, Liquid Metal Coating that can turn your dwarves into artifacts. So once again, what you're going to do is you're going to use Unwinding Clock, target the dwarf itself, the artifact dwarf. So for example, we will use Universal Automaton. I think it's a great example. It is a 1-drop, it is an artifact, and it's a dwarf. So say you have Unwinding Clock, and Universal Automaton. You tap both of them to create an untap trigger targeting the automaton. Magda will see that there is a dwarf being tapped and therefore make a treasure. Universal Automaton will untap, and now you have a Universal Automaton and a treasure untapped. You'll do the same thing, tapping both, targeting the automaton. Magda will see a tapped dwarf, make a treasure, automaton will untap. And what this will create is a loop where you make infinite tapped treasures. Now, Magda's ability asks you to sacrifice 5 treasures. It does not, however, say that these treasures need to be untapped. Now we're starting to see where we go from here. So you make infinite tapped treasures, and now you have infinite activations of Magda. One of the easiest ways to continue from here is to tutor out a Maskwood Nexus onto the battlefield. Now, the optimal lines for this deck will usually involve, just as a precautionary measure, tutoring a bunch of cards like Defense Grid and Trinisphere to ensure that your opponents cannot react to what you're doing. So, for example, the first card you ever want to tutor usually is Defense Grid, so that your opponents have to pay 3 more if they want to interact with your turn whatsoever. That's important to note as far as optimal lines of play being mentioned here, but let's talk about the combo specifically. So you have infinite activations of Magda. The next target is Maskwood Nexus. So what Maskwood Nexus says, creatures you control are every creature type. The same is true for creature spells you control, and creatures you own that aren't in the battlefield. Now that part's important because that's referring to your library as well. So now all the creatures in your library are dragons, meaning you can pull them out onto the battlefield. From this point, you get Zorn, and what Zorn does is it allows you to now start netting a treasure, because it says if you would make 1 treasure, you start making 2 treasures instead. So now instead of netting only tapped treasures, you are netting untapped treasures. So you're going to be able to start, now you have infinite mana basically at this point. From that point, there's a lot of stuff you can do. The one that I saw the most was you go get your Skirk Prospector. It's important, you need a sack engine at this point. So you have infinite treasures, you get your Skirk Prospector, you then bring out a Bogardan Hellkite, which allows you to divide damage as it ETBs against creatures or players. So it comes in and say you do 5 damage to a player. Then your Skirk Prospector recognizes it as a goblin because you have Maskwood Nexus out. You sacrifice it to make a mana. Now it's in your graveyard. So how do you get it back into your library? Well, you use a card like Elixir of Immortality, and remember, you have infinite mana at this point. You can then shuffle your graveyard back into your library, gain your 5 life, pull the Elixir back out, pull the Hellkite back out, deal 5 damage to another person, sacrifice it again. Do the same thing until you've gained infinite life and you've dealt infinite damage to all your opponents. So, kind of a complicated loop, but the point is, as soon as you get Clock of Omens and a dwarf that is also an artifact onto the battlefield, you win the game. That's it. Now, let's go back to the fact that we're running a bunch of 1-drop dwarves. Not only do you have this basically 1 card, 2-ish card combo on the battlefield, but all of them can be found with your commander's ability initially. So for example, a common play pattern will be to just play a 1-drop dwarf and then next turn have Magda out, and now suddenly you've already got 2 treasures. And to make 5 treasures, it really isn't that hard. You have cards like Dockside, you have Ragavan in the deck, you have a bunch of different dwarves, and you have a bunch of fast mana that allows you to accelerate into all of these things. So now you're suddenly able to get 5 treasures stupidly fast, and then you can have a ton of redundancy in the deck. As I mentioned, this card combos off, this card combos off, this card combos off, this card combos off, on top of the fact that this card can turn your creatures into ones that combo off, as can this one, and this one. So, oh, and Maskwood Nexus as well. So all of those cards, all of those redundant pieces just immediately turn your combo online as soon as you can tutor 1 artifact, which is obviously Clock of Omens. Now there are other plans in the deck. There's ways, as I mentioned, where you like tutor out more Stax pieces, tutor out more interaction. There's Blood Moon and Stranglehold, so there's Stax pieces all around. There's a lot of different ways to make it so that the game plan is happening, and to have pivot plans on top of that. So it's not like as soon as you interact with this whatsoever, the deck just completely crumples. This deck actually also has what I call the Kinnan effect, which is super frustrating to play against, because the Kinnan effect is having a 2-drop commander that has your entire game plan in the little barrel, like Kinnan does, and the fact that you can kill this commander, once again, a commander that makes a bunch of treasures and mana, and then all you have to do is pay 4 to have it back on the battlefield again. So even having the perfectly timed spot removal, like I did in our matchup, as my opponent, as Kobito was attempting to put their Ashnod's Transmigrant onto Magda, I was able to remove it in instant speed. But then next turn, 4 mana, play Liquid Metal Coating, we lose the game all over again. It was just that easy. So the redundancy in this deck is obviously pretty potent. You can't let it do its thing, which is super insane to say about a mono red deck. This performance was absolutely wild. I never thought a quasi-dwarf tribal, quasi-artifact Stax combo deck was going to be able to 7-0 a tournament. Completely undefeated over 2 days. This was a 100-person tournament. This was an IRL tournament. There were a lot of people in that room who are considered some of the best players in our format. And this deck was able to go undefeated against them. That's crazy. And it's super awesome to see. I think the diversity in cEDH has never been more clearly exemplified than in this moment. And it's so exciting to see. I'm so happy that this happened. I'm so happy that this performance happened with this list. Congrats to Kobito for performing very, very well. And I've been very clear in public about the fact that having played against them in my last round of Swiss, their play was incredibly tight. They were a very humble opponent, someone who basically said, you know, I stumbled into luck a bunch of times. And while I can totally see that happening, I also recognize that their play was extremely, extremely powerful, and they played very, very well and played a niche deck that has a lot of really unique micro interactions really well, right? There's definitely a lot of points in this deck where you could see messing up part of the combo. They played really, really well. They played a unique deck to an undefeated finish at one of the biggest events in cEDH. This was awesome. And I really encourage, if you like mono red at all like me, just take a look at this list. I mean, this thing is wild, right? Like the ability to like make a dockside and then like use your Magda mana to get a curse totem, which can come in as a dockside, make more treasures, stuff like that. The fact that vehicles become kind of busted in the deck because say your opponent's locked down the field, you can then just keep crewing them with dwarves and then making your treasures through Magda that way. This deck is awesome. It was really, really cool to see. I'm really impressed by Kobito's performance, obviously, in this tournament, but really impressed by the play I saw when I was in the match with them. The deck was really redundant, and I think recognizing a deck that can win at instant speed is super, super huge. Recognizing that potential in a list and recognizing the fact that the finals match of this tournament was lost because a Stax piece, specifically Suppression Field, was stopping Magda from going off. It was removed by one player thinking they were able to go off on their turn, and Magda was able to then literally win as soon as they got priority, which is wild. So having the potential to win at instant speed is absolutely gigantic. It's so cool to see a list playing so few cards that are staples in this format and being able to play it to an undefeated finish in this tournament. Congrats, Kobito. As I mentioned, they had talked about, you know, wanting to make swaps after the tournament. I'm not sure exactly what those swaps would be, but they had mentioned that their list was a little more outdated than they would have liked, and I'm not sure if any of those updates have been publicly talked about yet, but you know, keep an eye out for those because that's definitely there. Marchesa was an awesome event. I am super grateful to be able to have participated in that. Big shouts to Shaper Savant, who let me crash on their couch. Thank you, Shaper, for that. And you know, I'm also proud to have said that I made the semifinals of this tournament and lost to some really tight play and some lack of good top decks on my part. And it was a really awesome game. If you guys haven't got a chance to check that out, check out Monarch Media Stream. I also tweeted out about it the other day. But thank you for watching this. It was an awesome tournament to be able to participate in. I'm so glad to have seen so many unique decks in this top 4. It was a fantastic tournament. I'm lucky to be able to participate in it, and I'm gracious to be able to cover it right now. Once again, if you like videos like this, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, maybe hit that little bell so you can get notifications when we drop videos. And if you're feeling generous, join the amazing patrons who already support this channel, some of which who you will see in the show notes right now. Thank you, everybody. Have an amazing week. Peace.